Few people noticed it at the time, but over and over again, Barack Obama said things that offered us a peek behind the curtain. And what we saw should worry us. We're all paying the price for our blindness.
Recent scandals show that Harvard isn't what we once thought it was. It's now former President Claudine Gay. She was caught in 4 scandals, 2 of which made big news: anti-Semitism on campus, plagiarism, and lack of academic output, persecution of Roland Fryer, and law professor Ronald Sullivan. Then there's the plagiarism scandal of Harvard Chief Diversity Officer Sherry Ann Charleston. The most recent Harvard plagiarism case is one Shirley R. Green at the Harvard Extension School. She's an administrator over there, where she was accused of plagiarizing 42 times in her 2008 dissertation. And then there's the research fraud cases, such as cancer researcher Khalid Shah, his image manipulation scandal. And you have the data fraud scandal of Francesca Gino. 10 years ago, Harvard's Richard Hauser had a research fraud scandal as well. Are we seriously expecting this out of one of our greatest institutions here in America? We can do better than that. But it sounds like this is just the tip of the iceberg.
My most formative impression of what Harvard was came before I got to law school. I watched The Paper Chase. In that movie, Professor Kingsfield promises to transform, quote, skulls full of mush into precise thinking lawyer minds.
You're on an operating table. My little questions are the fingers probing your brain. We do brain surgery here. You teach yourselves the law, but I train your mind. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
Now, I know that's just a movie, but I'm pretty sure you're going to tell me that law school is something similar to that. So that being the case, that's a freaky class. You got to be prepared. You got to have knowledge. You got to study. And then everything that you think you know, he's going to be like, no, you don't.
When I actually got there, there were like 2 or 3 professors who were quite like that. I remember my property professor, instead of calling on people randomly like Kingsfield does, what she would do is she would write on the blackboard 4 names. And those 4 names had to go to special seats in the back of the classroom. They were called the law firm. And one of my best memories of law school is that I was in the law firm on the day of one of the hardest subjects in property. When I used the word that one property was appurtenant to another, Professor Mattis turned to the class and said, "Somebody's speaking like a liar." So yeah, a lot of the professors really were like that.
For me, thinking like a lawyer is crazy intimidating. I would have been like, I'm in major trouble.
Let's see what the Socratic method looks like in practice in the Paper Chase movie itself. I'll give you my comments as it goes on.
All right.
Hawkins versus McGee is a case in contract law.
Hawkins versus McGee is a real case in contract law. In many schools, the first thing they teach in contracts class is remedies. That's not how it was in my own contracts class, but this is a real case.
Subject of our study.
That was a big hint right there. A contract is a promise that is enforceable by law. A promise. Hart missed that.
A boy burned his hand by touching an electric wire. A doctor who was anxious to experiment in skin grafting asked to operate on the hand, guaranteeing that he would restore it 100%.
That guarantee is a promise. Big hint there.
He took a piece of skin from the boy's chest and grafted it onto the unfortunate boy's hand. The operation failed to produce a healthy hand. Instead, it produced a hairy hand. A hand not only burned, but covered with dense, matted hair.
So the contract was breached because the doctor was unable to keep his promise.
Mr. Hart, what damages do you think the doctor should pay? What did the doctor promise?
Big hint there.
There was a promise to fix the hand back to the way it was before it was burned.
And the result of the operation?
The hand was much worse than before he went to the doctor.
How should the court measure the damages? What should the doctor pay the boy?
The doctor should the doctor should pay for what he did.
First of all, that answer is very vague. He should pay for what he did? You mean like pain and suffering or something like that? But pain and suffering is something to be expected. It's not in the contract. It has nothing to do with the promises. You see, Hart is not thinking as precisely as a lawyer should.
He should pay for the difference between what the boy had, a burned hand, and what the doctor gave him,
No, this is about a promise, remember? Precise thinking. What he should pay is the difference between a 100% healthy hand and a burned and hairy hand. Hart has just messed this up completely.
a burned and hairy hand.
Mr. Pruitt.
If this is what really happens in law school, and Harvard is basically the top law school in in America, so let's take a look at Barack Obama's career. He went to, that's where he went. He got his law degree from Harvard. So he was in the law review, which means he was in the top of his class. So
Professor Lawrence Tribe mentioned about him that he had 4,000 students before Barack Obama, and he had 4,000 students since Barack Obama, and he's never had another student impress him more.
So his legal scholarship must be really something special.
Well, he was a professor of law at the University of Chicago, and U.S. News and World Report rated the University of Chicago Law School higher than Harvard Law School. So we can determine if Harvard Law School education is really like the kind that Kingsfield delivered simply by listening to Barack Obama's comments on the law. Have you ever heard of a case called Lochner?
No, I have not heard of that case.
Well, no reason to feel bad about that. I spoke to a couple of lawyers and a law student, and not any of them were really well-versed in Lochner. And this is because Lochner is a case that only law professors know about. It's a case of historical interest because it was overruled. So it doesn't figure into the everyday practice of law. People who own bakeries were protesting the Bake Shop Act, which did a bunch of things. One of the things it did was it limited the workday to 10 hours. Now, this might be a good idea. This might be a bad idea. But this seems to be an idea that should be implemented or not implemented by the states. The states should make this decision.
It's fanciness. I went to Harvard Law. I know a ton of stuff. I'm going to use big words, and I'm going to understand them. Unlike you, mister.
Don't be intimidated by law professors' discussion of Lochner, because in legal academia, Lochner is almost a way of saying, that's so lame, man. And it's covering up weak thinking. So anyway, here's what Barack Obama said to the Senate about Lochner.
For those who pay attention to legal argument, one of the things that's most troubling is Justice Brown's approval of the Lochner era of judicial lawmaking.
During the Lochner era, when federal and state legislatures used their police powers, the court upheld the laws the legislatures enacted the vast majority of the time. Also, there were many laws so obviously constitutional that nobody bothered to take them to court. It's a complete myth that during the Lochner era, legislatures couldn't get anything done because the court would interfere. Even in the Lochner case itself, the Bake Shop Act the court was examining had many regulations. The only one that made it to the Supreme Court was a 10-hour workday.
Now, let me just talk a little bit about the Lochner case. In the Lochner case, and a whole series of cases prior to them being overturned, the Supreme Court consistently overturned basic measures like minimum wage laws, child labor safety laws.
Even in Lochner itself, the Supreme Court said that legitimate safety laws were a constitutional use of the legislature's police power. The court never invalidated a child labor safety law. maybe Obama was being imprecise in saying child labor safety law instead of laws regulating or banning child labor. If that's the case, he's both being imprecise and wrong. Such state laws were upheld 9-0 under the Due Process Clause.
Rights to organize, deeming those as somehow violating the constitutional right to private property.
Wrong on 2 counts. First, Lochner wasn't about property rights, it was about liberty of contract. Second, there are all sorts of restrictions on both contracts and the use of property that the Lochner-era courts upheld.
The basic argument in Lochner was you can't regulate the free market because it's going to constrain people's use of their private property. Keep in mind that that same judicial philosophy was the underpinning of Dred Scott.
Wrong again. Dred Scott did state that it would violate the property rights of slave owners to ban slavery in federal territories. But that wasn't the main holding of the case. The main holding was the disgusting notion that black Americans had no rights under the Constitution. It wasn't a case about laissez-faire economics.
The ruling that overturned the Missouri Compromise and said that it was unconstitutional to forbid slavery from being imported into the free states. That same judicial philosophy essentially stopped every effort by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to overcome the enormous distress that had occurred during the Great Depression.
While the Supreme Court did invalidate some major pieces of federal New Deal legislation, they didn't do so under any of the doctrines that had anything to do with Lochner. He's also exaggerating when he says that they essentially stopped every effort to end the Depression. Economic historians have come to realize that the New Deal worsened the Depression, and it prolonged it by 7 years.
It was ultimately overturned because what justices like Oliver Wendell Holmes realized was that if...
Wrong. Justice Holmes retired in 1930. That was 2 years before the election of Franklin Roosevelt.
Supreme Court justices can overturn any economic regulation, Social Security.
The court's rulings on the Social Security Act had nothing to do with Lochner. Social Security is a federal law. Lochner is dealing with a state law. We'll see Obama have trouble with this one again.
Minimum wage, basic zoning laws.
Every time the Lochner-era court was confronted with a basic zoning law, they upheld it. Most famously in Euclid versus Amber Realty. But there was one exception. The court unanimously invalidated zoning by race in 1917. The progressives of the time were enraged. No matter, the court reiterated that holding in 1927 and again in 1930.
And so forth, that they would be usurping the rights of a democratically constituted legislature.
There's a famous case known as Caroline Products. It has a very famous footnote, number 4. The Supreme Court rejected the Oliver Wendell Holmes position that it should simply defer to Democratic majorities. What it did instead was say that for economic legislation, we defer to the states. And for civil liberties and laws that discriminate against minorities, we become more activist. When they did that, they were using precedents from the dreaded Lochner era.
That suddenly they would be elevated to the point where they were in charge as opposed to democracy being in charge.
President Obama had occasion to mention Lochner once again in 2012 when the Supreme Court was litigating the Lochner case. And he believed that the individual mandate, the mandate that says that each individual American citizen needs to buy health insurance, should be upheld according to the Commerce Clause. That's what everyone expected the Supreme Court to decide the case on. Instead, what actually wound up happening in the event was that the Supreme Court upheld the individual mandate, saying that individual Americans have to make a contract with a private company. They upheld it, but they said it was a tax. It's kind of ridiculous, but before the Supreme Court made its decision, President Obama had his comments on what the Supreme Court was about to do. Here's what Obama said. "We have not seen a court overturn a law that was passed by Congress on an economic issue like health care. I think most people would clearly consider commerce. A law like that has not been overturned at least since Lochner, right? So we're going back to the 1930s pre-New Deal. We have three mistakes here. Lochner deals with a state law, not a federal law. Lochner was a 1905 case, not the 1930s. And Lochner doesn't have anything to do with the Commerce Clause.
Okay, that Paper Chase movie is a lot, right? Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. How many mistakes did Hart do before he moved on to the next student?
That was less than the, dozen mistakes or whatever it was that Senator and then President Obama made. In a number of ways, the Bake Shop Act advanced the interests of the big, powerful bakeries over the smaller ones, because the big, powerful bakeries could afford higher labor costs. The smaller ones couldn't. So President Obama was wrong when he said that Lochner explicitly advanced the interests of the powerful over the powerless. So that's neither here nor there. I'm not meaning to be too hard on Obama personally. See, what it shows is something worse than one guy misstating the law or misstating a case. It shows a sloppy thinking that's tolerated in legal academia. It mixes together federalism cases and liberty of contract cases at the state level into one Lochner era. The problem is that Obama's just saying what everyone says in mainstream discussion of constitutional law and legal academia. And if this is how they talk, they're really not such impressive people.
When I look at the law, what do I want? I want precision. I want understanding. I want it to make it so that we know exactly what we're getting here. Like, say what you mean what you say, that kind of thing. You're talking law professors here. So the law doesn't matter to these people? That doesn't even make sense.
So, how did it get this way?
Andrew Breitbart discovered some footage in which Barack Obama was addressing a rally in support of Professor Derek Bell.
Because of the excellence of his scholarship, although his scholarship has opened up new vistas and new horizons and changed the standards of what legal writing is about. Open up your hearts and your minds to the words of Professor Derek Bell.
I got a little thing here. First off, who is Derek Bell? I got no idea who this is. So what did I do? I took a little deep dive into it. And what did I find? Is that he's a dangerous radical. He's the inventor of critical race theory that's infecting our schools, our corporations, our government even, and tearing apart the social roots of this country.
This stuff is really toxic. Critical race theory is based on a number of core assumptions. Tell me if these sound familiar to you. Race is the predominant structural element of American society, and that all analyses of race must incorporate systemic power, which is to say, systemic racism. Of course, this presumes that for all social phenomena, we don't even need to ask whether racism took place. Of course it did. Racism is everywhere. It's ordinary, it's permanent, and it's mostly very badly hidden. In other words, it's the ordinary state of affairs. What we should be asking is, how did racism take place in this situation?
Okay, right. So let me see if I got this right. So we're talking ordinary things like drinking milk, eating 3 meals a day, arriving on time, even wood paneling is racist?
Essentially, that's the idea. It's like finding racism wherever you can. Back to the core assumptions of critical race theory. Because racism is permanent, it cannot be overcome. It does not end. Instead, it changes forms to something more subtle and harder to find. Therefore, society doesn't become less racist or even stay the same, but actually becomes worse because it remains while becoming more insidious. And lastly, a duty of the critical race theorist is to expose this hidden racism wherever it can be found.
One of the beauties of this podcast is you turned me on to this guy, Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is a guy who's probably one of the greatest thinkers in the world today. And he looked at it. He looked at critical race theory, and he said, I think it's ridiculous. He's like, people publicly proclaim, people get out there, they get on their soapboxes and scream how racism is worse than ever. But privately, they know it's declining, which is what they don't want. They don't want it because if it declines, it'll cost them lucrative positions in the universities and the corporations and so on and so forth that they're there. By having critical race theory, this just keeps them permanently employed.
There is this extremely narrow ideological conformity that's being enforced wherever people have the power to enforce it.
I think it's fair to say that Thomas Sowell was one of the few people to see what retaining Derek Bell in academia would do to this country.
What did you think of Derek Bell's whole plan?
Well, his chances of success will depend upon whether or not he's overestimated his importance to the Harvard Law School. I think it would be a tragedy if they caved in. He has launched a despicable attack on a young black professor at the law school who doesn't go along with this. A young man named Randall Kennedy, written a very thoughtful, intelligent article last June in the Harvard Law Review, questioning some of the assumptions that people are making, people like Derek Bell, and doing it in a very gentlemanly as well as a very logical way, empirical way. And that's not what they want. They want the conclusion to be that they want him to march in lockstep, and he won't do it. And they're doing their best to make life impossible for him. I was very pleased to see that Alan Dershowitz at Harvard had criticized this, and then he picked up on the fact that what Bell is really asking for is not only that people be hired by race, but they be hired to fit Derek Bell's ideology.
At the time, after these protests that Barack Obama led, Obama's media enablers were able to use their verbal fluency and their persuasion tactics to sweep this one under the rug. But now it's coming out from under that rug and it's tearing our society apart. DEI over hiring and merit in admissions, examining people's innermost thoughts for dissent, for racism. It's gotten so bad that people are beginning to talk about civil war. The myth is that what comes out of the Ivy Leagues is precise thinking analysts of the kind that Kingsfield aimed to produce. Maybe that kind of analyst could have saved us from what Harvard is genuinely producing. Activists with toxic ideas that are tearing our country apart.